10th of December 2021.
Do you regard yourself as the underdog of this election?
I think it'll be May, possibly March.
Timing will be everything.
From news.com.au. News.com.au.
I'm Andrew Bucklow, and I've got news for you. Well, the countdown is on until the next federal election. We're still waiting for Prime Minister Scott Morrison to announce which date we'll be heading to the polls, but it will definitely be within the next 6 months. Hello, democracy sausage. In today's episode, we're going to peel back the Canberra curtain. An insider will reveal why elections are called at certain times of the year. He'll open up about the sneakiest election tactics he's ever seen. And he'll talk about the photo ops that politicians desperately try to avoid during campaigns.
The advances, where the leaders are going to be, there'll be people that'll probably go the day before and suss it out, partly for time and security. But, I'll say, look, walk this way, do not walk that way because there's a reject shop sign behind you or you're walking past an exit sign.
Julian Hill is the federal member for Bruce. He belongs to the Labor Party, and today he's going to be our federal election insider. Julian, thanks for coming on. I've got news for you.
Great to be with you.
All right, so we're still waiting for Scott Morrison to call an election. What are the factors that a government would take into account when making the decision on which date to call it for?
Well, the main factor is governments will go to an election when they think they have the best chance of winning. But of course, they can't hold on forever. We're not a dictatorship. We are a democracy. So there's limits in the Constitution also that guide when the Prime Minister can pull the trigger and call the election. What we're seeing at the moment, I think, is Scott Morrison is behind in the polls. He's a bit scared of an election, but he's scared of Parliament. So he's got a limited number of options now. Constitutionally, he really has to have the election by May to get the Senate and the House of Reps to have an election together. So the only two real windows now when you think about school holidays and Easter and that kind of thing would be early March or sometime in May.
How far out from the election do the political parties really start to think about their election tactics and what messages they want to push during the campaign?
Well, look, for me, it sounds silly, but it's true. For me, the next campaign starts the day after the last one.
Right.
Continuous campaigning for me on the ground is important. So, the formal campaign might only be 5 weeks, but if you've done the work over the previous 2 or 3 years, then you're really harvesting what you've sown.
Let's narrow it down to just the election campaign. So the Labor team, have you all got together and figured out what your tactics are going to be for the upcoming federal election?
Oh, we're absolutely ready. In both parties of government, if you like, the sort of Liberal Nationals or the Labor team, we elect a cabinet in the case of the government of ministers or a shadow cabinet in our case. Ultimately, it's the shadow cabinet that will sign off and decide those tactics. The full party room, of which I'm a part, we will be engaged, we'll contribute, we'll feedback, but those decisions are really made by the leader, the leadership group and the shadow cabinet, along with the party's national secretary in terms of the actual campaign mechanics. So we're ready. We've been ready since August, which was the earliest the Prime Minister could have called an election. And whenever he pulls the trigger, we've got our plans in place.
And during the actual election campaign, do you get daily talking points from the party, kind of a list of what messages they want you to hit?
It's not as scripted as everyone thinks. It's not like we're all robots and we all say the same thing and we read out the dot points. What might resonate in my electorate in southeast Melbourne, the most multicultural part of Australia in Dandenong, will be quite different from what's important to people living in North Queensland or outback Western Australia. It's such a big, diverse country. So we're not robots, contrary to what people think. We'll get a suite of policies and we'll get some advice on what are the kinds of things that we should be trying to emphasise because we think they're resonating with people, or we need to get our health policy across to people this week. We've got a bit to say on the economy another week. So it's kind of a bit more like that. You adapt the national policy and messages to what suits your community and what you think will work for you and people are interested in.
A federal election campaign looks exhausting and we're just watching it from the outside. What's it like for yourself or for one of the leaders of the party on a day-to-day basis? What does your schedule look like?
Oh, it's bloody awful, mate. It's tough. Look, it's a trite saying, but it's true. There's no such thing as an easy election. Elections are tough, and they should be. It's a contest of ideas, and in our society, elections and politics are how our society chooses to allocate power. And you change the government, you change the country. But they're serious things. People work day and night. There's no time off. For leaders, it's especially gruelling. They're all over the country, can be in 2 or 3 states on any given day. Marginal seat MPs and candidates are more likely to stay in their electorates, but other MPs may play more of a sort of a state or a national role and be buzzing around the place. Like for me, when I was first elected in 2016, it was a marginal seat, and I think that 3 months before the election in July, I don't think I left the electorate. I just, like 7 days a week, I'd be out at a railway station at 5:30 in the morning, you know, having a chat to people, getting told to nick off. You know, it's Australia. People know what, you always know what people think. That's not for the faint-hearted, but, you know, I might have a coffee and do a bit of exercise at 9 and then go door knocking, do some events, do some media, do phone calls till 8 or 9 at night, chatting to people, and then I'd regroup with my campaign team till 10 or 11 and kind of think, where are we at? What else do we need to do tomorrow? So it's a bit of a blur, but, you know, you should work hard. If you're not prepared to work every day in these roles, frankly, you shouldn't have them.
There are hundreds of campaign appearances that every politician has to do during an election campaign. Are they really well thought out, or are they just thrown together at the last minute because there's so many of them?
Oh, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. Look, it varies. There's a plan broadly about the key things, the key policies that we want to announce to the country to give people a choice. So we've got a bit of a sense of a mud map, if you like, of how we might go about that. But you've also got to be adaptive. You know, events happen. There might be a natural disaster. There could be, you know, we've got to respond to what the government's doing. If they suddenly have a big announcement, we might push something back for us, for the media cycle. So it's a little bit of both. There's a bit of daily planning, but that depends on the mood and the events and so on.
Have you ever had anything go wrong during a campaign appearance?
Yeah, things do go wrong. What do they say? Never work with children or animals. Children cry and animals might go to the toilet, so to speak. Look, the things that terrify particularly the people who work with leaders, where all the TV cameras are those unforeseen things you can't control. We saw Mark Latham's famous handshake with John Howard in 2004. Everyone thought Latham was going to become the Prime Minister. Then he did this awful handshake that looked like he was about to punch John Howard, and people went, "Oh, he's aggressive." Couldn't control that. You couldn't control another handshake. You know, Scott Morrison visiting the bushfire victims. No one wanted to talk to him. You know, people were furious about his failures in the bushfires, and the guy's running around forcing people to shake his hands, and it's all captured on camera. You can't control it if you're doing a press conference and, you know, a nice-looking old lady comes and walks past and yells out a bunch of rude words, or if you go to the footy, like, you know, Morrison was at Bathurst on the weekend and a bunch of people started booing him. They're the kind of things that get on the TV news. You go, oh, God. But also the advances, you know, where the leaders are going to be, there'll be people that'll probably go the day before and suss it out, partly for time and security. But, you know, I'll say, look, walk this way, do not walk that way because there's a reject shop sign behind you, or you're walking past an exit sign. Or when I went to a TAFE, there was a huge big banner that said tools, and we were doing some photos in my mind. I went, get out, there's a tool sign above your head. I'm like, oh God, you're all right. So that kind of stuff can come at you, but with a bit of good planning you can minimise that stuff.
What about sneaky election tactics? Are there any that you can kind of give us an insight into?
Oh, look, I'm a bit boring, actually. I largely ignore the opposition. I speak to my opponent the twice I've run and say, look, you know, I'll make sure we just have a little private chat, and I say, look, I want to set a good culture for the campaign, but how my supporters behave and how your supporters behave will largely depend on how you and I treat each other.
Okay.
And I have to say, the Liberal opponent, Helen Kroger, the first time I ran, she was the former Liberal Senator, Liberal Party royalty, and then a lovely chap, John McIsaac, last time. You know, I didn't agree with their politics, but they were decent people. We shook hands and we set a great culture. And I think that's a really important thing in democracy. That sets the tone. And I said, look, here's my number. If any of my supporters are doing silly stuff or vice versa, we'll just have a little chat and fix it. But I've seen other campaigns where it's not so civilised. There's always, you know, when you go to a polling booth and you see all the plastic stuff in the signs.
Yeah.
There's the sign wars. So there'll usually be young Labor kids or the obsessive old bloke around the corner who likes to win, who'll camp out all night to get the best spots for the plastic bunting. There's usually somewhere in the country, you know, a couple of idiots are arrested by the police for going and ripping down other people's signs and defacing their billboards, all of that. But look, at the harsher end, there can be pretty outrageous stuff. Like we saw last time, there was a ridiculous scare campaign run against Labor. It was below the radar, claiming that Labor has a secret plan to introduce a death tax. It was complete rubbish, but a lot of people believed it. It certainly shifted a lot of votes because someone, let's say, put a lot of money into it online. It was sneaky. And I think the Libs in Chisholm and Kooyong, 2 seats in Victoria, they got done by the court after the election for deliberately misleading voters. They'd printed signs in Chinese instructing them how to number the boxes and saying they had to vote Liberal, but they'd done it in the colours of the Electoral Commission, so it looked like an official instruction. It was deliberately misleading voters. Yeah, so that was found to be illegal. They didn't chuck the result of the Election Act. The court found that it probably wouldn't have shifted enough votes to change the result, although I'm not sure that's true, but that was the result. Fair enough, fair cop. But, that's at the pretty nasty end, which is just blatantly illegal and trying to manipulate and mislead people.
Joining me now is Evan Eakin-Smith from the Australian Electoral Commission. Thanks for coming on. I've got news for you.
Not a problem.
Running a smooth and successful federal election must be a logistical nightmare. Can we start with some facts and figures? How many polling places around Australia?
It is a logistical nightmare. I love the fact that somebody appreciates it. It's really tricky. So we often describe it as one of Australia's largest peacetime logistical events. We have about 8,000 odd polling places that will run, some in the early voting period, some on election day itself. 100,000 staff is what we need to employ. There's not many employers around Australia that have those figures. We do remote polling in areas of Australia that are particularly tricky to get to, overseas polling, taking votes from Antarctica, 50 million odd ballot papers. I could millions of pencils. I could go on and on. It's a big thing. And of course, COVID is a significant overlay to that as well, planning for those different environments and how we need to run services.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask about this pandemic. What effect is that going to have on next year's federal election?
Well, people are pretty used to it by now. You go to your local shops, you have to socially distance and check in. Sometimes there's venue capacity limits, those sorts of things. We'll have all of that going on. We'll have hygiene officers that will be cleaning voting screens, for instance, in between uses. As I mentioned, millions of pencils. Will be sanitising those between use as well. So there's lots of measures at the physical polling place. Of course, the other thing is postal voting, and we might see an increase to postal voting, but we won't know until we get there. And there's other services as well, like overseas voting and mobile voting in residential care facilities, and exactly what we can do there. And I think what's guiding us more than anything else, of course, is the health advice. So we're liaising very closely with health authorities, both at the federal and the state territory levels, and making sure that we take that best advice and implement a service that Australians can use.
Now, I was just having a chat to a workmate and we were debating what the definition of a donkey vote is. Can you tell me what a donkey vote is?
It's a lazy vote, in my opinion. We want everybody to come into the ballot box informed, and that means actually thinking about who you're voting for and having a genuine say. A donkey vote is essentially when somebody turns up and just numbers their ballot paper 1 to whatever, just running consensually down the ballot paper,
right.
Absent-mindedly. Don't do that. You only get a say once every 3 years. Make sure you actually think about it and input validly, I suppose, into who's going to represent your local community. It's actually really important and a thing that many people, overseas fight for quite hard, so don't waste it.
So who decides which order each candidate goes on the ballot paper?
It's a funny process. I think if people see it in person, it's actually kind of like a bingo draw. We literally get out the cage and we have some balls and we roll them around in there and we have somebody blindfolded who picks them out. So it's a randomised draw, and in fact it's a double randomised draw. We do it a couple of times to make sure that it's a fully random process, so all fair and equitable.
There will be fines for those who don't vote on voting day. How much is that?
There will be. It's only $20.
Okay.
I say only not to dissuade people because, well, far out, $20 is a nice meal down at the pub, so don't waste your $20. But more importantly, don't waste your vote. I say that constantly. That's really the biggest disincentive, that you miss out on your say if you don't get along to a polling place and cast your vote.
How far off do you think we are from being able to vote via an app for a federal election?
Probably a ways. Not up to the AEC to decide that, mind you. It would require large-scale changes to electoral laws, so it's up to Parliament to decide it. And they've looked at it a couple of times in the last 5 to 10 years and effectively said no, and we don't have an opinion on that per se, but of the people who do enter into that argument a lot, there's one side that sit there and say, well, convenience, ease, speed, both of voting and the counting process is on one side, and arguments for it. But clearly the other side is people's trust, which is vital, the ability to scrutineer it. So have people who can look over the shoulders of the counters, and, the threats of cybersecurity and all those sorts of things are on the other side. So Parliament's not seriously looked into it recently and flirted with it. I think it's some ways off personally, but who knows?
So what happens after I've put my vote into the ballot box? What's the process from there until a winner gets called?
It probably depends where you put it in the ballot box. So we take votes from overseas, we take votes from the other side of the country to where people are living. So it depends if it's got a transport, but at the very least, if you cast a vote on election day, it'll get counted at that polling place. We shut the doors at 6 p.m. We count every vote cast that day. There's probably somewhere in the order of 11 million voters, but 22 million odd ballot papers because the House of Reps and the Senate, and then we securely package them up, lock them up, transport them to a central location. We count them again. So Australians are very used to a result on election night. That's kind of not in our control. It depends how many votes we have physically in our presence on election night as to whether or not we'll know who will form government, but more often than not we do.
It must be a massive effort to run these elections. Do you guys have a pretty big piss up the night after or a couple of nights after?
No. The election night is effectively, we call it the halfway mark inside the AEC building, because it is. The count is just as big, if not bigger, than the first half of the election period, the voting period. So, of course, election night's a thing for everybody, and there's lots of people having election parties. The AEC is not one of them. We're working pretty hard right until the writs are returned. And even then, there's a heck of a lot of work to do to wrap up an election, give back those 8,000 odd premises in the right way, return all of our equipment. And we actually donate a lot of our equipment that we haven't used, including pencils and things like that. First aid kits in our polling places we give to remote communities. So there's a very small sample of what we do post-election, but there's a heck of a lot of work to do post-election as well.
All right, you lucky duck, I've got some fun election facts for you before I let you go. Did you know the largest electorate in Australia is Durack in Western Australia? And get this, it's bigger than France, Germany, Portugal, Spain and Belgium combined. Isn't that wild? Got another one for you. At next year's federal election, there'll be over 100,000 pencils used, and there'll be almost 150 kilometres of string used to attach all those pencils to the voting booths. That means that string would be long enough to stretch from Sydney to Newcastle. Weren't they fun facts? I thought they were. Anyway, thanks for listening to I've Got News for You. I'll chat to you again next time.